So let me start by welcoming everybody to this meeting, and just a bit of a background that in the Asia Pacific region, many of the poor and the most vulnerable live in areas affected by fragility and conflict, and these ADB countries face challenges including weakened governance, capacity, economic and social disruption, geographic isolation and insecurity. And conflicts and fragility not only impact countries where they're happening, but also neighboring countries and the global community, and many of you would agree with that. Today's seminar is aimed at better understanding the context, challenges, and opportunities specific to fragile and conflict-affected situation settings in the region by using knowledge from independent evaluation and experiences of ADB and other partners working in these settings. But before we start the panel discussion, I'd like to invite Sergio Lugaresi, Executive Director at the Asian Development Bank, to deliver his opening remarks, please. Edie?
Thank you. Thank you, Salia. I am Sergio Lugaresi, Executive Director for Belgium, France, Portugal, Italy, Spain, Switzerland. The ADB is carrying out a consultation on its approach to fragile and conflict-affected situation, FCAS, and small islands developing states, SIDS. Capitals have been consulted, been consulted individually in two waves. As this is a very abused word these days. There will be an informal board seminar on the issue next week and an institutional event at the annual meeting on May 3rd. The idea of this seminar is simple and clear, as to shape our constituency position on this important issue, starting from the lessons learned and developed by the independent evaluation department, and comparing the views, different views and perspectives. We have invited also our coalition partners, and I welcome ED Pandey and ED Fisher, as well as the new US Alternative Executive Director as a welcoming invitation. Is relatively new at the board. I would like to thank EAD and the team for the great job they've done. Since we discussed originally the idea, they have engaged speakers, they have organized written position papers, and organized the program, engaged the speakers. I would like to thank the panelists, and they showed how important is for us the coordination of MDBs and the views of our capitals. I will listen and try to learn from the seminar and come back for a few and short closing remarks. Let me just say one additional word on one of these FCAS countries, that is Myanmar. We are closely following the situation there with staff. There is a cooling off period where operations are suspended except for humanitarian purposes. We want to be sure that nothing is done to legitimate the brutal government there. But we hope that sooner rather than later, legality and democracy can be restored and ADB can work again with better tools, also because of this discussion, with these generous and courageous people. Over for me. Thank you, Saya.
Thank you very much, Edie. And as I had said in the beginning in my introduction, that we will bring you some insights from evaluation as well on this topic. And Ben will make a presentation on some of the evaluation knowledge that is pertaining to this topic. Ben is advisor at IED. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Saleha and ED Lugaresi, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this seminar. What I'm going to do in about 10 minutes, really just provide an overview of what evaluations have shown us over the years in terms of supporting more effective development in these contexts, FCAS and SIDS. Let's go to the next slide, please. I'm going to spend very quickly a little bit of time on the context in terms of FCAS and SIDS globally and also within ADB, and then discuss a little bit on just the countries and the main concerns and how ADB's been focusing on the operations in these countries. And then I'll spend most of the time really just highlighting findings from evaluations from IED. Thank you. Okay, so many of you already know this. Countries with unique challenges have long been recognized by the international development community. SIDS were first formally recognized by the UN in 1992, the Rio Declaration, whereas FCAS have evolved sort of from earlier concepts and classifications, low-income countries under stress, weakly performing countries, and so on. The development community's understanding and approaches to FCAS and SIDS have evolved over a couple of decades and have matured and generally become more harmonized, in particular on how to classify and manage operations in FCAS. ADB's own charter of 1965, already at that very early stage, pledged special regard to the needs of smaller member countries, smaller states in ADB. Today, Strategy 2030 reaffirms ADB's differentiated approach in FCAS and SIDS. And as we'll discuss later, there is a new FCAS and SIDS approach that is being developed now. It's important to note that in terms of ADB's operations in FCAS and SIDS, the portfolio has grown quite significantly in recent years. 54% for FCAS and 68% in SIDS over the period 2015 to 2019. This is based on the most recent APPR report. This is driven by mostly larger projects, not so much more projects. Next slide, please. So really quickly, what are these countries? And so on the left, you have a very simplified sort of diagram. You see the 16 SIDS that are there, and then on the right, the 11 FCAS countries. And those 8 countries in the middle are the ones that are in both groups. Now, on the right side, there is a much more artistic diagram from last year's DEFR, which shows the countries as well as the focus areas and the key concerns of ADB under its current approach in these countries. This may change, obviously, as the new approach is being developed going forward. Next. Okay, so let's look at what's available in terms of the evaluation base. There are different clusters or types of evaluations that have covered FCAS and SIDS at different levels and from different perspectives. These include country evaluations, a series of regional evaluations that have been done over the years in the Pacific, and then corporate evaluations. And you'll note there under the corporate evaluations, IED, the last time it did a standalone evaluation on ADB support to FCAS was back in 2010. But it has covered the issue under the last 2 ADF evaluations. And every year in the annual evaluation review, there's a special discussion just on ADB operations in FCAS and SIDS. Now, underlying all of these are project evaluations and validations at the project level. And there you have numerous validations and evaluations that IED conducts every year. Next. Okay, so if you look at the results at the bottom of that pyramid in terms of the project evaluations and validations, what you see here, the main point is that ADB's operations in FCAS and SIDS really do stand apart in terms of lower success rates, especially in recent years. The key takeaway here is that basically every other project that is maturing and being completed in FCAS and SIDS is not meeting its objectives. It's about 56% success rate there based on this 3-year moving average. Next. So one way to look at some of the findings from both project and higher level evaluations is along the project cycle. And so here we have some common observations or characteristics of some of these projects that have not succeeded and some of the reasons why they've not succeeded. At entry, in terms of the design of projects at that early stage, there's often insufficient understanding of the underlying development problem, of capacities, in particular capacities of counterpart agencies in the countries, of the ownership that they have for projects, of political economy dynamics, as well as change dynamics, and often lack of understanding or limited understanding of the duration that is required for reform, for example, and a general insufficient understanding of the overall risk that operations in these countries are exposed to, as well as weak project readiness. This often affects implementation of infrastructure projects. Once projects are underway and being implemented, evaluations often find insufficient support for implementation, limited capacity, again, and ownership of these projects in certain contexts, weak feedback loops in terms of how projects are performing, and ability to adjust mid-course to account for changes in the context. In many of the countries, projects are affected by unforeseen shocks of different types of political, natural disasters, and so on. Often it's difficult to get good consultants to work in these countries, so that is a recurring finding in a number of evaluations, as well as difficulties with contracting and procurement. One other issue that often comes up is high turnover of staff. Sometimes it's high turnover of staff in the counterpart agencies, and sometimes it's on the side of the development partner on ADB side in terms of turnover of staff that are managing projects in these countries. And then finally, at the end of the project cycle, some of the observations are weak sustainability. That's the most prominent finding of completed projects, is their less than likely sustainable rating. And this also relates to capacity limitations. There's often limited reflection and learning once a project is finished, and there tends to be pressure to move on quickly to the next project. And again, the issue of high turnover is seen at this stage. Next. Another way to look at the evaluation findings, and this is in particular with the country, corporate, and the regional evaluations, all of these evaluations speak to country context and provide sort of context and details and insights on the challenges of working in the countries. They also provide inputs on ADB support and the performance of that support. And then they provide forward-looking recommendations on how results and operations can improve. So let's look at those three levels. On country context, next slide. On country context, evaluations really cover a wide range of both causes and symptoms of fragility across these countries: social, institutional, political, environmental, and capacity-related conditions. These conditions exist irrespective of country income levels or classifications. And so sometimes countries graduate out of FCAS, but you still see many signs of these difficulties or these conditions. These conditions are both debilitating and destabilizing, and ultimately work against the achievement of sustained and inclusive growth. Some of these conditions are immitigable. You cannot take them away, but in all countries, evaluations recognize opportunities and areas for reform and improvement. A major challenge for all partners operating in these countries is really just understanding the context and identifying specifically where and how to intervene. One observation that often comes up is really this law of the instrument, which is, I have a hammer, and so everything sort of looks like a nail, so I'll use this one tool that I have in all the different contexts. And then finally, evaluations, probably more than anything else, cite capacity as a key constraint in these contexts, and also increasingly over time point to climate change as an exacerbating factor for all of these conditions in these countries. Next. Evaluation findings on ADB support and performance. Corporate evaluations in particular have highlighted that ADB's approaches have evolved over time, but there's not been a clear institutional shift to really focus on FCAS approaches. So the causes and symptoms of fragility continue to constrain ADB's effectiveness in these countries. ADB's approaches have evolved. If you look back over the last 10, 15 years, shifting from emphasis on growth to institution building, to participatory approaches to poverty reduction, to private sector development. And ADB has made some progress in differentiating its approaches, in scaling up operations, and improving staffing and field presence in FCAS and SIDS. But there's still these findings that there's underestimation of the prevalence of conflict, including subnational conflict, of violence, political economy factors, environmental factors like climate change, and of capacity risks. Performance is often held back by insufficient monitoring and feedback loops. That's a more recent finding from the Pacific and ADF evaluations. ADB has paid increasing attention to climate change, but much more is needed going forward, obviously, given the accelerating pace of this issue. And as I mentioned earlier, a clear and systematic institutional focus on FCAS is not yet evident. And then finally, on the way forward and some of the recommendations. Evaluations provide lots of recommendations covering different areas, and I'll try to sum these up in this slide. Really, one is on understanding stronger diagnostics and deeper understanding of the context and the risk in particular of working in these environments. Smarter programming in terms of more conflict, political economy, and capacity sensitive programming. Further differentiation, building on what's already been done in terms of evolving the approaches and the operations. This issue of tacit knowledge has come up in recent evaluations. It's really scaling up ADB's FCAS expertise in designing projects, managing projects, dialogue and consultations, and really getting people with tacit knowledge of doing projects in these contexts. Project readiness is again a recurring finding and recommendation. Sharper focus on preparation and readiness, especially for infrastructure projects. A more systematic and sustained focus on building capacity, not as a simple add-on, but really looking at capacity as a long-term investment in these contexts. Resilience. This is increasingly a recommendation at all levels of evaluations in FCAS and SIDS, building stronger resilience, especially adaptation and disaster risk management type of operations. And then finally, focus on learning. So more active monitoring, reporting, and learning feedback loops. And that's it. Thank you very much and look forward to the rest of the discussion. Back to you, Saleha.
Thank you very much, Ben. And with that presentation, I think we've set the context very clearly. And for those of you who've taken time out to come and be with us today, we can assure you that you can have a very productive session here because we've got an excellent lineup of panelists. I'll introduce you to the panelists now. We have Stephan Wegner. He's a Senior Evaluation Officer at the World Bank. He works on fragility, conflict, and violence, and he will bring in the global evaluation perspective. Joanne Asquith, Director, IED. She will bring in the Asia and the Pacific evaluation perspective. Stefano Berti, he's Senior Policy Advisor, Fragility, Conflict, Violence at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation. He will bring in his institutions and the European perspective. And Samuel Tumiwa, he's Advisor, Conflict Affected Situations at SDCC, ADB. He will bring in ADB experience and perspective, and perhaps speak a bit on the FCAS and SIDS approach paper. And moderating today's session will be DG IED Marvin Taylor-Dormond. Marvin, the session's over to you now.
Thank you very much, Saleha. Thank you very much, Ben, for a great introduction to the topic. It is estimated that by the end of this decade, 2/3 of the extreme poor will live in situations of fragility and conflict, either in states that are affected by these conditions or in regions within countries that are going through situations of this type. And obviously, extreme poor are the center of attention of the work that our institutions do. That's why we need to pay attention to this type of situations of fragility in conflict as challenges to accomplish the mission of our institutions and our bilateral organizations as well involved in supporting the developing world. And to talk about this, Saleha said, we have a fantastic panel, an opportunity to exchange on these topics. The plan is the following. We're going to have two parts of the conversation. In the first part, we're going to try to dig deeper on the issues that Ben spoke about, trying to understand the characteristics of fragility and conflict, the type of challenges that countries are facing, people are facing, and organizations like ours are facing to operate on the ground, both from the sovereign point of view and the non-sovereign point of view. And in the second part of our exchange, we will hear from our panelists on ways to address the issues that they will identify in the first part, including the new approaches that, just like the World Bank group is putting in place, or that ADB is planning to put in place. We'll hear some of their ideas in these two areas. And let's start with the first part of our exchange on understanding what the situation is on the ground and what challenges we are facing to address the needs of people living in fragility and conflict. Let me start with Stephan, a friend and former colleague at the World Bank group in IEG. And you have worked a lot on this topic, Stephan. You have produced a number of reports assessing the effectiveness or lack thereof of the World Bank group in operating in this context, especially with the private sector. What is your take on these challenges of working in fragility and conflict from the point of view of the World Bank group and the global perspective? Stephan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marvin, and thank you to you and Veronique, Saleha, and Sergio for having me here, and contributing to the panel. And we'll be very happy to do so. I should perhaps quickly say that we have produced a number of evaluations on FCAS, as you call them in the World Bank parlance. It is FCS, FCV, fragile and conflict affected states. And so we have, some findings also on more specific items like forced displacement and so on. And we're producing at the moment evaluations on IFCs. So this is the non-sovereign part in ADB. IFC's engagement and MIGA's engagement, the Political Risk Insurance Agency in fragile and conflict affected states, or FCAS. So I'll be happy to provide a bit more detail on these items, but perhaps I will start with sort of a big picture about the current situation, especially with the onset of COVID, and then just give a few highlights of some of the findings that we've developed over the last 7 or 8 years for the World Bank Group. And then I leave some more detailed comments for the second round and for questions and answers. So I think to survey the big landscape, I think, as Marvin mentioned, the World Bank Group has just adopted a new FCV strategy, which we may come to speak a little bit later in the session, which was adopted and endorsed by the board actually just a few weeks before the onset of COVID. And so that has affected the implementation of the strategy. But we have to say that even before COVID-19, FCAS countries were facing mounting challenges. We've seen an increase in violent conflict to the highest level seen in 30 years. This is a finding from a few years ago. We see the largest forced displacement crisis ever, in the post-war period. And we see many reversals in progress that had been achieved, in the earlier years of this century. Sergio mentioned the case of Myanmar. If we take a longer perspective, we also see a downward trend in Afghanistan and other countries, Ethiopia, Mali, and so on and so forth. And we see overall an increase on FCS or FCAS situations around the world. Now, fast forward a few weeks and COVID started. And what we've seen actually over the last 12 or 13 months is that the pandemic has exacerbated existing fragilities. and vulnerabilities in the world. So we see that FCV countries have been harder hit than other countries by the crisis. The primary effect of the pandemic on health systems that are under-resourced, have very low capacity, will be especially severe. But the secondary effects may be actually more pronounced on the economy, on the private sector, local firms, social effects, poverty effects. Marvin was referring to the statistics. So we expect that more and more people will be pushed into extreme poverty. So this will push up the 2/3 that are expected to be of the extreme poor that are expected to be in FCAS countries by 2030, even higher. So this is threatening livelihoods. Per capita incomes are going down. Remittances have decreased considerably. Many of those countries rely on remittances. But more importantly, the COVID crisis also heightens FCV risks in countries that are already fragile, but also those that are not. So we're seeing an increase in protest. We see forced displacement refugees hit especially hard. I mean, you know, try social distancing in a refugee camp, for example. We see an intensification of violence and conflict, increased food insecurity, and last but not least, also an increase in gender-based violence over the last year. So this is perhaps, you know, just the highlighting some of the issues that we're facing as you are developing the operational policy note. Then perhaps let me turn very briefly to some of the key findings that we've developed over the years. Here we're seeing broad alignment with what Ben was presenting earlier. You know, this need for a differentiated approach to address the development challenges, you know, the risks, political risks and security risks, dealing with security risks in FCAS countries. We've identified 4 broad areas where development partners can and should engage. One is to build the capacity of the state, which is so important to, you know, to deliver services. To build capacity of citizens and deliver basic vital services such as on infrastructure, health, education, and so on and so forth. The importance of special attention to gender, right? Because gender, women or children often used as a means of war, right? Forced displacement affects 80% of the people affected are women and children. And then this issue around private sector, you know, jobs, to provide sequence support to promote jobs and livelihoods to people that involve both private and public sector solutions. And perhaps just very briefly before I close, on this issue around you know, changing the business model, you know, having a differentiated approach in FCAS countries. I just underline some of the things that Ben has said, you know, the critical need to understand the drivers of fragility, because every country is different, you know, it's a very heterogeneous group, and translate those findings from the diagnostic work into strategies and programs. The need to work in partnership and effective coordination between different players, including humanitarian actors. Particularly important in these environments because of the low capacity of many of the government counterparts and the inability to deal with many different donors in parallel. To deploy wider array of tools that are adapted to the country context in FCAS, and then real-time monitoring evaluation that can allow mid-course corrections or frequent corrections as we learn on the ground. We've also noticed that there's relatively little evaluative evidence at the project level in FCAS countries. So I think the built-in monitoring and real-time learning is very important. And finally, patience and realistic expectations of what can be achieved. Progress takes a lot longer in low-capacity environments than in other countries of operation. So perhaps I will stop there, Marvin. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that overall perspective. And now I'll move to Joanne. Joanne, you also have been doing a lot of work in this area. You were the task leader of the recent evaluation on the ADB fund, ADF, which touch upon the issues of fragility and conflict as well. And you've been looking also at the usefulness of policy reform to address some of the issues that Stephan was talking about in fragile context. What's your take? What's so difficult to work in this type of a context, and in what way has COVID affected this context?
Thank you, Marvin, and thank you, Stephan. What I'm going to do is just pick up on a couple of points that Stephan has already raised, because I don't want to repeat too much, and I'll base it on a recent evaluation that we did of the Asian Development Fund, which, as everybody knows, or I hope everybody knows, is now a grant-based fund. And what we found is that a lot of countries now that receive grants are also FCAS. And one of the key findings of the evaluation, as Stephan noted, was this, it's kind of, lack is a strong word, but kind of a thin base, or a thin evaluation base, because monitoring and evaluation is in FCAS and SIDS follows the ADB process, which is largely to do project completion reports. And so project completion reports are done, that's fine, but there are very few of them. There's only a handful in any particular period. So, you know, if you've got 14 Pacific countries and 7 evaluation reports, what can you say if they're all in different sectors? So it's very thin, and related to that is the content of these reports. So they are not focused on so what was it about the project that differentiated it from projects in non-fragile countries? So you know, did ADB, you know, was the context explained thoroughly? Was there a specific point of intervention that was made because of fragility? And then what did ADB do differently? And so if that's not captured in the project completion report, then there's very little evidence on what was the differentiated approach, and did it work or did it not work? So in a sense, our monitoring and evaluation system, it's not appropriate really for fragile states, and it's not appropriate, and it's not capturing the kind of information that we need. What was done differently, why was it done differently, and did it work? And to have a conversation around that. So on COVID, and if we think about COVID in the Pacific countries, that they're quite unique in the sense that because they're so isolated, and also because they are small, it was a fairly easy thing to close them. I mean, literally close them, which meant that for many, they lost their primary source of revenue and an economy, which is tourism. So the Maldives, Fiji, other countries, the impact of COVID on their economies has been enormous. I mean, these countries have closed their borders to keep out the virus. So they've managed to contain the virus, but at the same time, they have their main areas of revenue have been completely shut down, which will have massive consequences for the rest of the economy and the links to the rest of the economy, massive impacts on employment, revenue. It would be catastrophic. I mean, the amount of investment that's gone into hotels and infrastructure and so on. So that, and it will take, in the last, you know, in the global financial, in the last global financial crisis, the small Pacific Island countries weren't affected immediately because they weren't really linked into global financial systems. They were quite separate, and it was seen as a blessing initially, and the impact came later as people reduced their spending on tourism. So we saw this delayed impact on small island countries, but this time the impact has been immediate, and it will be prolonged. And one could say that the recovery will also be very slow, because it will depend on people's confidence in traveling, and also it will depend on how quickly major markets recover, so that travel and tourism can rebound. I mean, I know that some countries, including the Maldives, have offered all sorts of incentives to people to travel, but it's unlikely that the tourism sector will pick up quickly over the next few years. Okay, I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for that perspective. More now, looking at the situation in our region, in Asia Pacific region. We turn now to hear the views and perspective from Stefano. Stefano, if fragility and conflict cooperation for development in this context have been central for Swiss cooperation for a number of years. And you have had your own experiences, successes, failures at many of all of these organizations. Can you tell us from your own perspective and the perspective of the Swiss cooperation, what the issues are and how have you been able to manage and maintain your commitment to support development under these conditions?
Thank you very much, Marvin, for inviting us, and thank you to all the panelists who already spoke, and also Ben's presentation. It's actually most of the elements you have already presented, so I'm gonna maybe highlight some of them. First, let me say, because Marvin, you introduced that this way, I mean, we are all on the same boat. It's not, none of us has the magic recipe on how we should deal with fragility. Bilaterals, banks, United Nations, even humanitarians, we all have difficulties and we are all struggling. And actually, sometimes I have a little frustration, because for the last 30 years we have heard speaking about leave no one behind, even if not in these terms, or do no harm, and we are still talking about those. But it's probably, we have to go through there. But now, even because of COVID, we now really have to deliver on those discussions, and we have to change. We believe working in fragility is very important, because they are going to concentrate. Fragility is increasing, as Stephan said. Fragility concentrates, as Ben said, also in your case, ADB, most of your portfolio, most of your work. If we don't, and performance there, again, as Ben said, is not as good as in other contexts. So if we don't pay a particular attention to those, we will leave them behind. And these we cannot afford. We cannot afford to leave anyone behind, any citizen or any country, but also because there will be effects, spillovers on other countries, on regions. So I think even if you only have 2 or 3 countries identified as fragile, as purely fragile and non-SIDS, or even including the 8 SIDS fragile, I mean, we have to pay a particular attention to those, otherwise the whole region risks to be destabilized in a way if we let them go. It's important, it has been said, to really understand fragility under all its dimensions. And these you refer in your analysis, in your FSA concept note approach, to the 5 dimensions of the OECD DAC, the State of Fragility Report, and it's very important to understand that fragility is multidimensional. And when we see this multidimensionality, we see that one thing triggers the other. So it's very important to understand the whole picture, and it's very important also to understand that probably there is also fragility in countries that we are not calling fragility, and ADB should also understand that. I don't want to pick some countries, I'm not an expert of your region, but I'm sure you will already directly think about some countries where you say, actually in that country that is otherwise stable, there are regions that are fragile, there are pockets of fragility. And it's very important an institution like ADB understand that and adapts also within stable countries, non-fragile countries, adapt its approaches to solve those issues. Otherwise, same spillover from the little region to the big country and then to the wider region. And this is, there is a particular challenge that is mentioned in the State of Fragility report that I think concerns Asian and Pacific region and you, ADB. The data on fragility on these 5 dimensions is missing on, I think it's 8 or 10 countries that are really mentioning as we are not finding all the data we would need to put them on our fragility spectrum. And I think this is probably something that ADB could play a role, also helping out OECD, DAC in getting those data, but they're also having those data, having this deeper understanding of fragility dimensions in all of your countries. This is extremely important. Another point that we always insist on, and the bank, for instance, with this FCV strategy last year, they entered into that. They admitted the importance of governance, of social contracts, public trust. These are not things that the bank, any bank, development bank, is comfortable. I don't want to say comfortable, used to work with. I mean, you have other approaches. But it's important that you realize, that we all realize that those things are, we need to understand them. We need to read them, analyze them, and understand our impact on them. Because even if you enter in a country with a specific sectorial education infrastructure project, you will have an impact on governance. You will have an impact on social trust, on public trust, social contract. So that's very important that you place that, we all place that in our understanding and broader analysis. Well, colleagues have already said COVID, impact of COVID, accelerator, magnifier of fragility, absolutely. Probably also a wake-up call for all of us. We have to act stronger. We have to prepare better for the next one while responding to this one. So that's probably something that we can see as an opportunity. And my final point, it's again something that other development banks have been putting clearly in their vision. It's prevention. Really, with all these analyses that we are discussing, with all these better understanding of the multi-dimensions of fragility, drivers of fragility, we will be able to act preventively and prevent this fragility to spill over, to escalate, and manage actually to diffuse those drivers of fragility. Yeah, thanks, Marvin.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Let me now bring Sam. Sam, you are the key person in charge of the subject in ADB over the last 2 years, and so we all know that you've been working hard on this new operational plan for the institution. But not only that, Sam, you have not only worked intellectually in producing that context as the former country director of ADB Afghanistan. So you really understand what is the challenge of what are the challenges of operating in fragile and conflict situations. So can you give us your perspective? What are the issues? What are the problems that the recipients are facing and our organizations are facing while operating in these contexts?
Thank you very much, Marvin. It's really an honor to be here, and I'm glad to share my thoughts with others. I also, though, want to acknowledge that Leah Gutierrez, the Director General for PARD, is in on this call also, and she has a lot of expertise, of course. And Paul Curry, who is leading the Pacific approach, is also in on this call. So maybe when the Q&As go through, please note that they're here. I thought maybe I'd spend a few minutes just talking about the specificity of the context in which we're working, which is Asia and the Pacific, right? Ben mentioned earlier that our charter talks about, small countries. So, we have a special focus on the Pacific when ADB was set up. And so if you look at the specificity of our context, it's really about fragility. And when we talk about FCAS, we often think about conflict, but really it's about fragility. Of the 16 SIDS in our region, 8 of them are FCAS, okay? And of the 11 FCAS countries, 8 are SIDS. So really, we're talking about fragility. And within this fragility in our region, it's really important to break that down. So you have Laos. Laos was rated as a fragile, classified as a fragile country just last year. And the reason is because of debt sustainability. And it had graduated, and then now because of debt sustainability, it's now become rated as classified as a fragile country again. And amongst the Pacific countries, or amongst the SIDS, you have those SIDS that are large resource-based exporters. Papua New Guinea, PNG, Timor-Leste, Solomon Islands. They are natural resource-based economies. PNG and Timor-Leste had graduated from FCAS, are not ADF countries, but because of the low global price of oil and then therefore the price of gas, they've now become fragile again. And then in some of the Pacific Islands, Joanna had talked about tourism, and there's some countries there and islands that are tourism-based economies. And that's the fragility there is very, very different. They're hit much more by COVID. But then you also have the small atolls. We had a call in the preparation of the FCAS and SIDS approach with the finance minister from the Solomons, the Cook Islands, and he just talks about tiny. Everything is tiny, and the fragility that comes with being a tiny nation. And so I think it's very important that we understand this context. We throw out FCAS, but really we have to break it down and understand this. And then we have the 2 countries that are in conflict. We have Afghanistan. Well, in Afghanistan, it's a national conflict. It's not just, it's at war, and it's a multifaceted war. There's the Taliban, there's IS. There is, and then there's NATO, and then it's a very complicated issue. In Myanmar, it's a conflict, but it's a very different type of conflict. It's an ethnic conflict, and between states and the central government, and so there again, we need to understand that context, and we can't just say, okay, this is the EDB FCAS approach. It's going to work for all of them. We can't. We really need to be context specific, and I think that's what we're trying to get to. We did a lot of, there's been a lot of discussion about the evaluations. There was a 2013 operational plan, and we did a review of it, and substantively it says all the right things, and it did. It resulted in some context specificity in some countries. It increased the staffing in the resident missions in the Pacific, but it was not fully implemented. There were some resource constraints, and there was perhaps some institutionalization issues. So we looked at the lessons learned from this and all the evaluations, and I think it's very important that in the preparation of the FCAS and SIDS approach, I wanted to highlight that we did this because the IED evaluation called for it, but also the ADF donors wanted a new strategy for ADB because ADF is pretty much now an FCAS fund, as Saleha just said. So we really need a new approach. We wanted to do this in a very consultative manner, and so we've had, as ED Lugaresi said, 2 rounds of consultations. We shared it with the board to bring in the capitals. We've met over 300 individuals and had over 70 consultation meetings over 23 different countries. We met with DMCs, donors, civil society organizations, humanitarian organizations, other MDBs. You know, we talked about the World Bank has got its new FCB strategy. Islamic Development has a new FCAS strategy. African Development Bank is just redoing theirs right now. It's a 2-year process for their transition strategy. Even the Nordic Development Fund is developing an FCAS strategy. So there's a lot going on there. So we've had a lot of consultations, and we did talk. We talked about the drivers of fragility that Stefano talked about, and the importance of that and the understanding of that. And I think it's also the really good point he made about that fragility is multidimensional, that it's compounding. If you look at one, economic drivers or structural drivers, you can't. They all feed on each other, and then it's complicated by natural hazards, climate change, and then conflict. But the five drivers of fragility there. And then where we seek to make our intervention, we seek to get to resilience and recovery and growth path. But we also need to understand that not all countries will get there. There are some structural things that, and I think Ben touched on this, where there will be countries that will remain fragile for a long, long time because of the structural constraints on the limited natural resources and then the human resources. So we need to face that reality. So this is what we mean by FCAS and SIDS in our approach. And I think when we talk about what ADB is trying to do, we also need to look at the context in which we are at ADB. You know, right now, this team is quite new. We started in August 2019. We have 3 staff, hopefully then a 4th one soon. The World Bank, I think, has 40 people in their FCB team. So we need to be very strategic on how we do this. Resources are going to be continue to be a problem. How do we implement the FCAS and SIDS approach when we outline them? And so we propose to engage at the as high upstream as possible to really set the path straight, instead of, yes, we can get involved at the project level, but that takes a lot more resources. So we really want to do it in the diagnostic stage of the country partnership strategy. We've also made a commitment to the ADF donors that 60% of the CPSs in FCAS will have a fragility assessment. So we're proposing a fragility and resilience assessment. But the fragility assessment looks at all the 5 drivers of fragility plus that humanitarian development peace nexus, not to forget that, which is another dimension, and really look at that and really frame the context for that country, for our work in that country, and that then informs the CPS. But more than that, this is not, unfortunately, we still don't have a methodology. We've done one already for Afghanistan. We use the methodology of the African Development Bank and Islamic Development Bank. The World Bank was just redoing theirs. But then we will learn from others and develop one. But we also have a governance risk assessment that we already do. Now, this is not required. This is something in the lifetime of the CPS that we'll do. But now we're doing it before the CPS is done. The governance risk assessment looks at public sector financial management, procurement, and anti-corruption. And together, between the fragility risk and DGRA, this should really, really inform the CPS and how we need to engage in that country, and the capacity issues and the contextual issues. Moving on to then project design, again, when at the concept stage of project design, we're really encouraging the DGs and the sector directors and to make sure that the concepts refer back to the fragility and resilience assessment, refer back to the governance risk assessment, and to make sure that it comes through. Of course, during implementation, there are a lot of things we do that don't need to be changed, but need to be tweaked a little bit in our processes and procedures, right? So we have a lot more flexibility there. And then finally, in monitoring and evaluation, and I think Stefano also brought this up, we promised that we would set up a special monitoring and evaluation system under the 2013 operational plan. We didn't. We have now. We now have a database with all the projects that are operating now in FCAS and SIDS. Looking at, how are they doing? Are they on time? Are they behind schedule? Are they meeting their safeguards requirements? All this, not that we want to take over the portfolio management function of the regional departments, but more to have a long-term view. We want to build this database that goes back 10 years so we can do the analytics, we can do the knowledge product to see what's working. That's just an introduction of what we want to do, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that you actually address much of what we expected in the second part as well. I want to encourage our audience to ask questions. Put your questions on the chat box, or prepare your questions to intervene shortly. I'm going to post a challenge to our panelists to see if in 1 minute, so that we can leave an opportunity to exchange with our audience. 1 minute of what do you think that has to be done now that we understand the context better, and how would success look like? What's clear from what has come up so far is that what is needed is good understanding of the context, differentiated approaches, and we know from what we have heard from the panelists that the situation is expected to aggravate going forward. What should be done? 1 minute, and we interact with our audience. And let me start then again with Stephan. 1 minute, you will have a chance to answer other questions from our audience.
Thanks, Marvin. I see you posed the hard questions to us. Look, I think the key is, and many of the panelists have already referred to it, right? How can we move from a situation where, for lack of a better word, it's business as usual, but it's deploying the development solutions and instruments in the manner that we know how to deploy them, to apply them in a way that is more targeted to address the drivers of fragility and conflict, to make a difference in those countries. But this is not so straightforward as Sam was just saying, and Stefano also, that it's a multidimensional issue. Drivers of fragility are interrelated and so on. But that to me would be sort of the a measure of success. Are we seeing country strategies and operational programs in FCAS countries that are more designed to address those drivers, more sensitive to fragility and conflict? However that looks like, and it will look very differently in different country contexts. But I will pose one question back to you and others, and this is because you asked, what does success look like? And I'm just reflecting on Ben's presentation about the lower results in FCAS countries. But isn't that something that we should actually expect? I would actually argue, playing the devil's advocate a little bit, that if we were aiming to have similar success rates in our operations as in other country environments, we would do something wrong. You know, we wouldn't take sufficient risks. We wouldn't take chances, or perhaps, we would go with a low risk option, pushing out money the door, but not addressing the core issues of fragility. Let me stop there.
Good, thank you very much. Sam, you are left with that question to respond at the end. John, 1 minute.
Okay, I have a few points. So one of them is that corporate targets should not apply to FCAS countries. So targets, the ways of doing things, they always have to be differentiated for FCAS. There needs to be more patience, and I think this relates to the point that Stephan just said about performance. So a 50% performance rate is not bad; it's pretty good. And in fact, take more risks. A really simple one is never work alone. The capacity in these countries is so thin that you should always aim to be working with another partner or several other partners, no matter how difficult that is. It reduces the constraint that you put on these very very thin departments. I would say differentiate further, because we have countries, this point was made, we have countries that are not identified as fragile, and yet we've just done a Cape of Bangladesh where violence against women is very, very high and increasing, but it's not a fragile state. But if you look at it from a gender perspective, you could say it's very fragile. So differentiate further in what we mean by conflict and violence. It's not necessarily a full-scale war, but it could apply very much to women. And finally, work with what you have. Try not to introduce new processes. And I think this is something that Sam just said. You know, ADB produces back to office reports. Use those to capture the kind of information that we need to come from the ground. So don't invent a new thing. Use what you have to build in the kind of information that we need to collect. And I'll stop there. I hope that was a minute.
Thank you. Stefano, what's your take?
Thanks, Marvin. My 3 points. Maybe one coming from what Sam said. These came from the donors of the ADF, who saw that ADF, the fund, became a fragility fund. I'm fine if the donors are the spark of this initiative, but it cannot just be donor-driven, otherwise, or donor-pushed. It has really to be the institution going through that. It's also what you said, Sam. Maybe there was not institutional support for the previous concept or approach. So I really recommend, and again, it's a challenge for all of us. We are also working on our own fragility approach. Do a forward-leaning as possible fragility approach, but be realistic in what the culture will allow and the management will support. And push the border, push the frontier a bit, but not too much. Otherwise, in 7 years, we will be here again saying, that fragility approach was pushed by the donors of the ADF, but now we want to do something more institutional. Second, and probably it contradicts a bit my first point, once we understand conflict, once we understand fragility through a multidimensional analysis, let's not aim just at doing no harm. Let's really think ahead. We need to. After COVID, we really have to. Let's think about what is peace enhancing. Let's think about what is stability and resilience enhancing in what we are doing, in what the ADB is doing. And finally, it has been said, partnership is the new normal to work on fragility, nexus, to connecting the instruments. And this means understanding also what is an ADB comparative advantage. What can you do? What is your added value? You certainly have a role to play. You're not pushing that far enough, probably in fragile context. Understand it, sell it, and really build on that. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stefano. And now, Sam?
I just have one word. For me and for the FCAS team, it's about changing our mindset. The mindset of ADB, those working on FCAS and SIDS, I think they're there. For the most part, people who are in the Pacific region know it. It's an existential issue. They're working on it. Their mindsets are there. But the corporate departments, okay, the corporate departments where they're not thinking separately, the procurement department, financial management department, OGC, even PSOD, working in an FCAS situation is it. So our goal is really, and all the good things that everybody said is noted, but really we need to really figure out the mindset and who's going to drive that change in the mindset. That's what we have to figure out and change. We can have the nicest FSA, but unless we are able to do this, and this is our biggest challenge. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Wow, that was extremely efficient this time. The other extreme, and that gave us some time to exchange with our audience, and we have some participants that already raised their hands. First it's AD Fisher. So I'll turn the floor to you, AD Fisher, if you would like to raise your question. Then AD Rose, that is asking about ownership, posed the question, but the role of ownership. AD Fisher first, please.
First of all, thanks a lot to Sergio, IED, and every panelist for this very interesting thing. I think of it as a good ramp up to next week's IBB. And what I'm really hoping for is an FCAS approach that makes a positive difference. And my remarks have to be read against this exact purpose, because I really agree with Stefano. If I hear differentiation, adjusting the way we have to work, taking risks, being realistic, acknowledging the nexus, etc., we really heard that before for a long time. So my question really is, what's new? And I have some guesses about that. And I think the hints were really Samuel's, because quite obviously, this is about resources, financial resources, admin resources, and personnel resources, knowledge resources. That's why if I ask myself whether this approach will be effective, I will not be only looking at the text of the FCAS approach, but I will also be looking at the next work program and budget framework. I will also be looking at the progress at the Knowledge Management Action Plan. And maybe, just as Samuel says, we probably should also be looking at the way we are organized in our processes and our structures. So I would ask every one of us to look at these contexts and these interactions, because these are, I believe, the things that really decide whether this approach is effective or not. Final thing, I really want to underline what I think Stefan said. I think it's obvious the pandemic can be an additional driver of fragility and conflict. And we need to know more about how this effect can play out. I would like to see ADB or the entire INCAF community as anticipating effects and potential risks, so we can really engage in prevention. Thank you. And just a final point, of course, my point on the work program and budget is really the same as Phil tries to make. This only works with high-level ownership.
Thank you very much, ED Fischer. Let's take a couple of comments and questions. There are some comments, there are some questions that would need to be addressed. Also, suppose Sam and reaction from the other panelists. But let me now turn it over to AED Rose on the issue of ownership.
So thanks, Marvin. I mean, that question's already on the chat board, so you can answer that, or maybe you don't want to, or maybe Sam doesn't want to answer it publicly. But I have a couple of sort of supplementary issues to throw on the table. One is I still hear a lot of, this is all very well for the UN, but it's no good for the MDBs. It's not the MDB's strong suit. MDB's trying to do this. It's like trying to do microsurgery wearing boxing gloves with loans as the primary instrument. It'll never work. So what's your counter to that? And second, just to comment that I couldn't agree more with, I think it was Stefan who said, or I'm not sure who it was, that this needs to go beyond the official list of FCAS. If we're just going to be talking about Afghanistan and a few Pacific SIDS, it's not going to excite that many people, and nothing much will change in the way the organization approach, because it's just not a critical mass of countries there. But if you extend it to situations of fragility, then it's going to be capture a lot more of the essence of the organization. So those would be my two additional points. Thank you.
Thank you. Rose, there is a question from Lucia Xenofonte. It is about the issue of coordination. I don't know if you would like to pose the question or we address it the way you have wrote it on chat box. The question is
Yes.
on coordination. Yes, Lucia.
Hi, good morning. Yes, my question is about the increased coordination at all levels, also among countries themselves, relating to increased coordination and integration, as it is, for instance, the case in Afghanistan, where that's a good example where integration and big infrastructure projects of ADB have benefited not only Afghanistan but the whole region. And my question is about also the importance of having coordination among IFIs, all development partners, and you mentioned that. And I was wondering if you have, if you are considering implementing country platforms to maximize the contribution of each partner. Our idea is that the implementation, the use of country platforms is a good tool to make each institution work on its specificities and converge around common standards, which would be an important part of the development path of fragile countries. And one last point I would like to mention, maybe you can tell me more about the next steps that are expected to improve diagnostics. Samuel was mentioning and with details, giving a lot of details, very interesting details about the country specificities. He was giving a lot of examples, and I think this is very well connected to the need to improve diagnostics.
Thank you, Lucia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me start with Stefano this time. Any comments or reactions to the questions that have come up?
Just quickly, maybe on Lucia's points, I fully agree. There is a better coordination dialogue to have at all levels, in particular at the country level among the different stakeholders. And actually, I believe, though you might not see it the same way, regional banks like yours, they do have a convening power. They do have a role to play in that regard, not just by sharing and participating in those spaces and sharing information, but also leading them when they can. This is something the World Bank has committed to with the FCV. I was in the field before FCV was accepted, and I saw the World Bank not being very comfortable in playing that role. Now I'm curious to see how they are implementing that, but I do believe that regional banks can also support World Bank and others in convening those spaces, not just sectoral, but also on governance, on broader issues, on fragility, and have a clear, frank, transparent dialogue at the also, and in particular, at the country level. This is the most important. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefano. Stefan.
Thanks, Marvin. Yeah, I agree on the comment on coordination with what Stefano has said. I mean, we've also sometimes found that, you know, taking up the mantle of FCAS or FCV in the field depends on the characteristics and the interest of the staff who are there. So whether it's a task team leader or a country director who is really interested, attuned to the fragility agenda, they will go out of their way and help foster collaboration and dialogue with other donors. But where that is lacking, you have maybe a more of a business as usual approach based on volume, creating volume that is very different. And that brings me back to the other question that was asked about what is by Mr. Fisher. What is asked, what has to be different? I mean, look, and I speak a little bit here not in my official capacity, but my personal observations. So look, budgets and resources and HR are important, you know, having people in the field, deploying people who have the local knowledge, who can connect with local players, with government and non-government actors. But resources only get you so far, right? And I think you also asked the question about ownership. I mean, in the World Bank, for instance, the FCAS agenda is located as reporting directly to the managing director, which is the number two official of the World Bank Group. And so that has given it a lot of visibility, a lot of traction. Now, is it perfect? I mean, I think you know, it's too early to tell, as a famous Chinese premier would say. But you know, it did give it much needed visibility. Let's put it this way. It's too early to say whether, you know, now on the ground we've actually moved the needle. That will be, you know, in a couple of years or so when we review that. But I wanted to say, so in addition to, you know, attention from the top, in addition to budgets and resources, I think what we have found is critical is incentives. So if the institutional incentives from the top are not aligned to do projects in countries that are higher risk, more easily to fail, take more time to prepare, more expensive, then I think that's a critical issue. That's a critical issue, and Sam was talking about changing mindsets. I very much agree with that, and that's part of it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Joanne, any reaction?
I agree with the points that have been raised so far. I'd like to respond to this idea that the MDBs are not suited to these operations because they're wearing boxing gloves. But I think that there's some very simple things. I mean, in every country, you need to understand the context. You need to understand it very well in order for projects to succeed. And the context is very different in fragile countries. So that deep understanding is so important. And looking at the risks, and it's not the usual risk assessment. It has to be a much deeper risk assessment, especially now during the COVID era, because we are seeing countries where things could very quickly unravel. So being able to make that assessment, to review risks which are now evolving in different ways than we've seen before, and that is so important. I liked the idea of I think this whole idea of incentives and having more time to prepare, and the point that Sam raised about making the whole institution, all of the different parts of ADB, understand the FCAS agenda. And we talk about one ADB, but often the real constraints that you face are within the organization itself. So this need for speed, this need to get approvals out the door, you know, there needs to be the patience and space given to slow it down, so that we can remove the boxing gloves and we can do a sharper, cleaner operation with a greater understanding of the context.
Thank you, Joanne. Sam, last word.
Thank you very much, Marvin. Perhaps I'm not going to take them all on, but just two comments. One, I think when we talk about working in FCAS, I don't really think that we understand the context. We've studied this, but it's really about doing good development, right? And Joanna just talked about that. You're doing good development, and the problem is we often don't have the time. We don't have the R word. We don't have the resources, and human but time to do it. And the IED evaluation didn't say this. We don't have the empirical data to say this, but my sense is if in 2011 we changed our operations in ADB, better, faster, stronger, to ramp up our operations, right? 2011 we did it, right? So now 5, 6, 7, 8 years later, now it's 10, but when you did your evaluation, Joanna, it was 8 years later. it really shows that in the smaller, least developed countries, where you need a bit more tender loving care, where you need a little bit more time in project preparation, TAs, which you used to have, we're getting hurt there. And it's really showing. I can't find, we've tried to do it, we can't find it, but it's my sense. I remember 2011 when I was in the office in Washington, D.C., in the ADB office there, people going around and talking about our new procurements. It's going to, instead of 18 months, it's going to take 9 months. Instead of 24 months to deliver a project, it's going to take that. It's that, I think, and we're trying to, and I think the point Joanna made also about targets. When I was country director, it was all about contract awards and disbursements. And we changed that. We got an exception for Afghanistan. It should not be. There was a $300 million project in Afghanistan grant to do a back-to-back converter station for power. There were only 5 back-to-back converter stations in the whole wide world, and we were having trouble with them. Why did we think that the 6th back-to-back converter station should be done in Afghanistan? So I canceled that project because we shouldn't be doing it. And then I got into trouble. And so again, back to Joanna's point, we should not do, it should not be based on that. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think we've come to the end of our exchange. We've heard a number of keywords from the panelists without the intention of summarizing, but key to operate in this context is good understanding, ownership, realism, incentives in the institution, risk-taking. The context is different. Partnership, one alone cannot make it. Prevention, not only work on addressing the issues, work based on your comparative advantage and allocate the appropriate resources. I think our panelists have done a great job in presenting the issues and discussing the alternative for action, and they deserve a very warm round of applause. Thank you all very, very, very much for your contribution. And I will turn it over now back to IED Lugaresi for some closing remarks. With my thanks to everyone, all the participants, for your comments, your question. John, your question, your comment was well recognized as well. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Marvin. Thank you, Saleha. Thank you, Stephan, Joanne, Stephan, Samuel, and to the board colleagues that participated. It was very interesting for me. I took note when I said at the beginning that the aim was simple, clear. I underestimated the importance of this seminar. Now I realize it. It's not only the consultation on the approach on FCAS, fragile countries and so on, is the whole approach to many countries. I took note of many suggestions, real-time learning, the importance of data, and the importance to tailor and to shape, to formulate projects for each specific case, to be specific, and many other issues. For this reason, I think that we will stay in touch, engage in discussion with the evaluation department, with the capitals, with the experts, with the other players, multilateral banks, and so on. And thank you again. It was very, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joel, for joining us at this time, 4 o'clock for you in the morning.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you very much.